with us today at the Healing the Divide table. Welcome everybody as you're coming in. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Reverend Jacqueline Frazier.
Oh, it's Reverend Jacqueline, Minister,
muted.
Doctor, everything.
Jacqueline, excuse me.
Good morning, good morning. Oh, you saw my mouth moving. Good morning, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Oh, that makes me want to sing my, when I was early childhood major. That's one of the things that we used to sing, the good morning song to all the kids.
Good. Come on, everybody do it. We can all do it.
Know, you can make a joyful noise if nothing else.
Yeah. Unmute yourself and everybody sing.
Oh, I'm not muted. Am I muted?
No,
No, you are muted.
Jacqueline.
It's Saturday the 13th of June. We have a peaceful protest right here. Everybody gets along. Welcome, friends and family.
Yes.
Does anyone have any problems that we are aware of? Is everyone muted? I'm assuming.
No, I refuse to unmute myself. So.
Okay. Good morning, good morning. Just want to say we have an exciting webinar coming this morning, brought to you from CRM, Minnesota. As you know now that we have changed from the face-to-face to the virtual webinar that we're having right now. We are glad to have all of you here. I just want to share some housekeeping items related to Zoom that will be very helpful to any of you. First of all, if you're muted, on the left-hand corner, if you are using a phone or if you're on a computer, you have a mute feature that you can use. Use that so that we can keep the background noise limited. Then we have another feature for stop video. Please use that at your own discretion. If you need to walk around, I'll say this, I'm not trying to be ugly or have to go to the bathroom, please put stop video on, just for your own personal reasons. If you go into the participants piece, you can see who's there. Is an option to raise your hand. There's an option for you to raise your hand. Also, if you go into the feature, you will see that there are different things that you can choose. Just as I suggest that you go in it before we really get started. And then there's a more feature that says chat, meeting settings, virtual background, disconnect your audio or disconnect your video. You can put that in there as well. And this webinar series is Healing the Divide, and we focus on participatory, the roles of conflict resolution, practitioners, partners, stakeholders, and a divided community, especially with what's happening in our community right now. We are so glad that you took some time out to come see us today. We really, really appreciate it, because there are a lot of other things that you could be doing, but this is the best place for you to be this morning. I just also want to say that if you have any questions, direct your questions to the chat, and the questions will be monitored. We have our individual that will be sharing the information with us, which is Deandre. I'm not sure how he's listed. Let me see. Right now he's it just says Deandre right now, but he's our person who will be taking the questions from you. If you have any, please put them in the chat feature, if you don't mind. Also, I covered the basis of Zoom, and I would like to introduce you first of all to our president, Lauren Thrift. And so Lauren, if there's something I missed, please let me know. But I just want to say good morning to everyone. Take a deep breath, if you don't mind. Can we unmute for just a second, whoever's muting? Good looking has a hand up. Okay. Let's breathe, please. Breathe with me. Breathe one time. Breathe 2 times. Breathe 3 times. And then pinch yourself and let yourself know that you are here and you are in for a treat. Good morning, Lauren.
Good morning, Reverend Jacqueline. How are you?
I am awesome. It's so good to see you this morning. I'm glad that you're here.
Thank you. What are we going to be covering in our agenda today?
Oh, a lot of stuff we're covering in our agenda. I'm not going to go through everything, but our speakers for today is Sam and Connor. I'm not going to give their last names. They're going to introduce themselves to you, but we have Lauren's coming up, and then we also have Deandre Gordon. Lauren is our president, and Deandre is one of our board members. And Yukasha, I'm not sure if he's here yet, but I hope he is. And then Dr. Raj with the small aura, and he's going to do our brave space.
Come on, everybody, move.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
You're welcome. Thank you, Lauren.
And then there will be time at the end for Q&A and a little bit of wrap up too.
Right, so if you have any questions, please let us know what they are. There will be a portion where we're going to do a midsection, but I did see a hand up. I hope that Deandre has that taken care of. Thank you. And good morning, everybody.
Good morning. My name is Lauren Thrift. Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Thrift. I'm the current president of Conflict Resolution Minnesota for one more week. We're about to have board elections and elect a new president next Saturday. I hope that you all join us. It's going to be an amazing event. We have a documentary and discussion on the film, a local film called My Story, My Truth. And it's about the stories of African Americans in the local area, telling us about their experiences with racism. It's going to be really powerful. So I hope you'll all join us next Saturday. Information can be found on our website, www.conflictresolutionmn.org. So right now we are sitting in the midst of unprecedented times. We are being called to listen, and we're being called to take action about what it'll take before we're ready to heal the divide. Last month, we heard powerful personal stories from these 3 amazing keynote speakers, Representative Jejong Bartun Ismail and Dr. Tamara Madison. They spoke about racism and human rights violations that they personally have experienced and witnessed, and we heard their call to action. And now June is Pride Month, and we're here today to learn about the intersectionality with what LGBTQ plus people face and what we can do. Just as our state and nation are focused right now on racial divides, we also see intersectionality with the violent brutality and human rights violations towards LGBTQ plus people, even more so towards Black trans women, and the systemic inequities, oppression, and silencing of LGBTQ plus voices. So thank you for joining together today at the Healing the Divide table as an opportunity to learn together and to move into action. So what is the role of conflict resolution, and how does that tie in with us being here today? The 1964 Civil Rights Act, Section 10B, is a call to aid individuals and communities in resolving disagreements or difficulties around practices that impair human rights and thereby threaten peaceful relations. National Association for Community Mediation partnered with us last April 2019 to host listening sessions where we asked the community, what can conflict resolution do to help achieve human rights for all? And here's what we heard. Conflict is not good or bad by itself, it's an agent of change, and it's what we do with it that makes negative consequences or positive outcomes. Rather than resolving things too quickly that'll flare up again if we don't transform the roots of our culture and systemic issues, The words resolving disagreements or difficulties are a call to transforming the roots of conflict and not just resolving superficially on a surface level. At the Healing the Divide table, we are here to explore our role in how to answer this call in Minnesota. Right now, the Minneapolis City Council has voted to work with the community to build community safety together, and the Minneapolis Police Department is under a civil and human rights investigation. And recently, a Black trans woman was brutalized, and this is not an isolated incident. So today we're here to take a deeper look at what it'll take before we're ready to heal the divide with the LGBTQ+ community, which is an intersectional piece of creating community safety together. We also invite you to join us for our webinar in August that'll look at proposed changes to Rule 114 through a human rights lens. Although conflict is uncomfortable, it is an opportunity for growth, for transformation, and for healing. What will it take to heal the divide? What will it take before we're ready to heal the divide? What deep, sustained work needs to be done to transform a conflict at its roots if we want to get on a path towards healing? It's clear it's going to take a transformation of our culture and the roots of conflict that got us here. So what do you think? How can we respond to this call to action in the Civil Rights Act? How can conflict resolution help achieve human rights for all in Minnesota? You see a link there, and we are going to put that into the chat. It's actually a survey that you can click on that link and put in your thoughts. And Conflict Resolution Minnesota supports the field of conflict resolution and all those who work with conflict in Minnesota. This is our amazing board. We have spent the last year taking a deep dive into our own selves and how we function as an organization to be better able to support this field. Support also includes taking a deeper look at ourselves personally, in our work, and how we operate in conflict resolution in Minnesota. This Healing the Divide series is an opportunity to do that together in a brave space, and we hope you'll join us at the Healing the Divide table for upcoming webinar workshops and the online gathering conversations to continue this work together. I'd like to introduce board member and student representative Deandre Gordon, who will share more about the work we've been doing as a board this year that we invite you all to join us in. Thank you, Deandre. Welcome.
Thank you, Lauren. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your Saturday to join us today for this webinar. I want to first start by saying that over the last year, the CRM board and the wonderful conference committee actively worked to move our conference away from being in person to being virtual, which is more accessible now more than ever. Like Lauren said, like our board has been doing a lot of work over the last few months to really like unearth privilege and decolonize ourselves and the functioning of our board. We first started by listening, then creating a vision, and then action. Historically, the conflict resolution space, the sector, has upheld like white supremacy culture, and that is like a continuing problem. My hope and the hope of this board is that before we can go into community and do the necessary work that needs to be done, we must first understand what privilege means and all the different layers to privilege, because none of us is like human beings like operate in silos or are one-dimensional, and that is where intersectionality comes in. So some of the work we've been doing is we've had like weekly like privilege meetings where we sort of reflect and like share experiences and how we operate and move through the world. With that being said, like we can't do the work without community, and which is why I'm inviting all of you on this webinar to consider applying to the board of CRM. Like this work is not something that we're gonna start doing and then stop. We need to like continue to do this work, to sit in discomfort and to use that discomfort to like grow, because conflict does not have to be confrontational. It could be collaborative, and conflict is definitely an opportunity to actively engage and uplift the voices of our most marginalized groups, which includes Black and Brown people, people in the LGBT community, and immigrant communities and various other communities. With that being said, I'd like to turn it over to our wonderful conference committee chair and one of our board members, Ukasha, who will tell us more about the work of the board and where we're going for the next few months. Thank you. Ukasha?
Yeah, thank you, Deandre, and good morning, everybody. You can type down good morning.
Good morning, Akasha.
Hi, let me open this. Yeah, welcome to the CRM webinars. It's really exciting to join you guys again as a host and as well as a conference committee chair. I'm really excited to invite every one of you to the CRM Conference 2020, joining us in these online conversations with the amazing theme of healing the divide through a participatory approach. So a participatory focus on the role of conflict resolution, practitioners, partners, and stakeholders in a divided community. What is this conference objective? The objectives are more of defining our division, an actionable step to healing the divide, equitably engaging voices who are historically harmed. And as you all have seen in the past few weeks, there was riots going all on our backyards. So many tense situations, and this was caused because of those unheard voices. As Martin Luther King always said, riots are the results of unheard voices. So for every voice to be heard, we have to bring that engaging voice onto the table. So exploring culturally humbling conversations in diverse communities, confronting our own biases in everyday work and life. This country has been going through so much. We are in a pandemic, under another pandemic. We have been struggling with COVID-19 and all the MDH guidelines. I'm a good mask maker, by the way. In this pandemic, what we are trying to envision is how we can start those conversations of healing in every corridor, in every space. As you can see, we can see a divided nation that is really evident. People are, like going against each other, and politics are pitted families against each other. Children have been taken away from their families, and right now we actually yelling and yearning for police and community reforms, police community reforms. So how can we change all that? We can change that through a participatory approach, and I'm really excited for you joining us in these conversations and even other conversations and webinars to come. Again, I want to thank you all, and I'm sending my heartfelt gratitude and thank you to all the amazing conference committee who have been working day in, day out. Even after the keynotes, they're still there helping us, kind of to navigate in this unprecedented time, and as well bring these conversations back to the community. I hope every one of you enjoy, and thank you so much. Have a wonderful, amazing weekend.
Appreciate Kasha.
Now I will go ahead, invite Raj to the conference, to the webinar. Raj will take us to the safe and brave spaces.
Hey, where are my people who are keeping the control over this place? Can I see everybody's face and just take out the PowerPoints and all that stuff? Okay. So appreciate, I want to thank our speakers for being here. Some amazing folks, presenters, right? Connor, not so much, but Sam, like the great, but we love Connor too. But But I also want to appreciate our president's hard work, Lauren. So if you will, in your own way, let's applaud Lauren's hard work in keeping moving, and Ukasha's dedication to bring this this conference together in pieces, albeit, but nevertheless, it is useful and helpful. So I appreciate that. Appreciate our MC. Appreciate our one and only Deandre Gordon, right? Soon to be the president and the governor of the state of Minnesota someday soon, right? These are my predictions, so y'all can, call me out on it. But I want to invite us to take a moment, right? Think about June 15, 1920, 10,000 people lined up the streets in Duluth. 10,000 people lined up the streets of Duluth and watched 3 young Black males being lynched. And they had no compunctions about it. No compunctions, no thought, no reflection. It was a brave space for them. Because their ideology, their belief systems was all being played out on that stage. And if you look at the pictures of people gathering to witness lynching throughout this country, it was as if you're watching modern day, parties they have outside football games before they have these football games. People gather, bring their sandwiches, sit down, and those association, right, is exactly what they did. They brought their blankets, their picnic baskets, Sunday best, ate their sandwiches, stood up and witnessed lynching throughout this country, right? Because it was a brave space for them, right? Because the ideologies, their belief systems was being played out, right? So with that said, I am really conscious of where we are today, right? And when Lauren and others said, let us create a brave and a safe space, we really want to be intentional about that, right? And we want you to be able to take that brave and safe space concept and construct and live it in the communities that you are going back. Because we don't want you to just come here and listen. We want you to turn everything that is being heard here into action in your communities, right? Listening has that power. If you listen with your heart and generate that emotions, couple that with your intellect, then you create that fusion energy that is necessary for change, right? Listening is not just about hearing things. Listening is about processing and learning. And in that learning and listening, the outcome is leading, right? Which translates into action. So we want you to feel safe in that sense, that be present, right? And not be afraid to be yourself in this space, right? And that's a safe space, right? A brave space, on the other hand, right, adds a layer to that safe space where you're not only just being present and being seen, but you're also going to be heard. You are also going to wrestle with your ideas, right? Right, wrong, good, bad ideas. We are all going to wrestle with them, right? What does that mean to say Black Lives Matter? What does that mean to say George Floyd? Right? 45, the president decided that on Juneteenth, right, June 19th, he was going to have his large gathering in Tulsa, Oklahoma. 1921, right? almost 100 years ago, Tulsa, Oklahoma was burned down because of the fear that Tulsa, Oklahoma was now becoming the Wall Street for the Black community. That's our history. 1919, there was a young man killed in Chicago for purportedly crossing the black and white divide on the lake, Michigan Lake, right? So there are, and that led to the burning, and that led to yet another commission report in 1920, right? So there's, and Richard, is it Richard and Mimi, what is it? Right, Kenneth and Mimi, right? The people who studied, who did the doll experiment in 1954 to undo, right, separate but equal regulations that were passed in 1890, right? When they were invited to the Senate in 1967 and asked to help the Senate understand why people are burning the streets in the US, and Kenneth looked at him and said, you know, it's crazy that you have invited me here, because I looked at the report in 1894, the very first report that was written that documented police brutality against the Irish community in Boston. 1894, y'all, first commission. And he looked at the report in 1920, 1930s, two reports in 1940s, one report in 1960, and he looked at all of them. Guess what? Nothing changed. Right? Bob Marley said in his song in 1976, right? The title, I think it's about burning and looting, where he says, right, we're burning, in one of these lines, burning all the pollutions tonight, burning all the illusions tonight. And that's what we saw on our streets. People are burning those pollutions and illusions. Not just the buildings. It's easy to cast that as a riot. But there's a lot of illusions and pollutions in our society. Just yesterday, the Senate decided that they're going to walk out in Minnesota without passing any of the reform bills. We have a challenge ahead of us. And we need all of you to be involved in this brave space. We need to undo that 10,000 people who set their foot and watched the lynching. We need 100,000, we need 200,000, 300,000. Hell, Hong Kong brought in 2 million people out. Right, let us bring that 2 million out, because we need that change here. We need that brave space and a safe space for all of us to be together. So love y'all. Thank you. Let us burn the illusion and the pollution together. I want to appreciate and invite our MC, Master Ceremony, the one and only Representative, no, Reverend Dr. Minister Jacqueline. I can't remember her last name, so I'll leave it.
Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Sorry, I just dropped my paper.
Man, Connor has got like his 16-year-old picture here.
Oh yeah, he looks very nice. Everybody does. Can you see me? I would like to introduce our presenters for this morning. I am so excited about what's happening and what they're going to do. The first one we have is, we have Connor's picture first. Connor Suddick, he, him, his, and they, them, their, is a Promise Fellow at Community Mediation and Restorative Services Incorporated, where he facilitates community peace building circles and restorative conferences at Robbinsdale and Osseo School District. He is a founding organizer of the LGBTQ plus Justice Transformation Collaborative, online hub that aims to uplift the voice of the LGBTQ plus people who are restorative practitioners. Great work. Transformative justice advocate and prisoner abolitionist. His academic background is in social justice. I also would like to say he went to Hamlin as well. I used to be a registrar there, so we got a chance to find that out a couple days ago. LGBTQ plus history and policy development, conflict transformation, and legal studies. He was born in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and now stays in Brooklyn Park Center in Minnesota here. Our other presenter, along with Connor, is Sam Coltis. She's Community Mediation and Restorative Services Incorporated affiliate and School Service Coordinator. They're awesome people. Sam works at Community Mediation and Restorative Services Incorporated as a restorative justice practice point person in their community partnership with Cooper High and Robbinsdale Middle School. She keeps circle, works in school to prison pipeline disruption and juvenile justice transformation and mentors. She mentors school-age youth and AmeriCorps Promise Fellows. She is a LGBT queer community member. Her academic background is in interpersonal communication and conflict. She was born in St. Cloud and now stays in the St. Paul Hamlin Midway area. As they present, don't forget if you have any questions, you can send your questions to Deandre in the chat space, as well as you can send them to me if you have anything. I'm Jacqueline Frazier. My name will be changing because they're going to ask you to put your pronoun in as you change your screen name, if you don't mind. So let's present Sam and Connor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for, the grounding by Deandre, Ukasha, Dr. Raj, just always a teacher, and really honored to be with you all today. So first we're just gonna ask you that you can see as Sam and I have modeled in our names, you can see that we included our pronouns. And so this can be your he, him, your she, her, they, them. And so we just wanna encourage you to do this practice as we offer different tools for inclusion. How you do that is if you see the little window with yourself, check yourself out. And then you go to the little 3 dots on the very right-hand corner. And then so the little 3 dots in the corner of your picture, and then for me, it's about 5 down, you press rename, and then you can add your pronouns that way.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and then Sam will kick us off.
Yes. Well, I suppose if you're in this space, you already know why you're here, but I'm gonna just read the title slide anyway. And it says Conflict Transformation and Restorative Justice with LGBTQ plus people. And thank you, Reverend Jacqueline, for the introduction. It felt really good. I noticed that my hair is really grown out since that photo was taken, and that feels nice. This has been like the quarantine haircut growth. It's something that I've been looking forward to, so that was nice to see that progress. I want to start off with just kind of first naming some elders and queer mentors who we're here in this space as ourselves, presenting ourselves and as ambassadors to the queer community, but I didn't get here alone. So just within my own life, my personal mentors' names include Amy and Zoe Glass, Rachel Mills, Connor Suddick is somebody who I consider a mentor, and Nunu House is one of my students who is also a mentor to me. And then beyond that, the writings and teachings of James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, and Erica Hart as well have been really, really transformative to me and just who I am here speaking to. I'm a white, cisgender, queer woman. I'm from St. Cloud, but I've been part of the St. Paul community for quite a while, and well, just short of like 10 years, but also a Hamlin grad. And so Reverend Jacqueline and Connor and I made that connection the other day. Connor, do you want to do any type of introduction for yourself as well?
So for me, I just also want to name mentors where Sam Coltez, T. Aaron Hans, oh my God, and like I'm not going to name them individually to protect their identities, but my middle schoolers that I work with at Robbinsdale Middle School teach me new things every day, and I miss them dearly. And then I'd also say really informed and empowered by the teachings of Sylvia Rivera, Miss Major. Andrea Jenkins is a writer that you should really check out their book, The Tea is Not Silent. And so first thing we can do, and so those are the mentors I want to name and bring in this space. I actually currently live in Illinois. I just moved a month ago out of Minnesota, but really I know I'm from Wisconsin and then I moved to Illinois. So I'm really just really betraying the Minnesota community, but my whole heart is with you all, and really feeling the hurt. And I'm also just amazed by how everyone is coming together and uplifting each other. And so I'm gonna, if we can keep the slide off, I'm just gonna go do brief acknowledgement. I think Dr. Raj did an amazing job of grounding us in a brave space. And Sam named it too, that we just wanna name that we're both white facilitators and our history is linked to the colonization of the United States and the removal of indigenous people, the genocide of indigenous people. Colonization is ongoing, and we acknowledge the sovereignty stories and history of the land we are on. For me and Gurnee, that is the land of the Peoria people historically. And then for Sam is the land of the Dakota. And their survival is a testament to the wisdom and resilience of these nations. However, land acknowledgements, as I've recently been reminded, cannot exist without action. And so a couple of things I just want to point people to is that we can aid, and we see a lot of intersections with Indigenous sovereignty, with stopping line 3, a development that where private interest is usurping the sovereignty of Indigenous people, which I'm including a link in the chat. And then also an organization you can support is Honor the Earth, which is located up in, I believe, the White Lake Reservation by Winona LaDuke. And pardon me if I named that incorrectly, and you can learn more in the links that I just sent in the chat. So with that also, we are presenting this to you in Pride Month. And so we want to acknowledge that we are speaking up, but do not speak for the entire LGBTQ community. We're not a monolith, and we're offering our own experiences and perceptions and learnings. None of this training is meant to be exhaustive by any means. And also just based on timing, we might go a little over today just to ensure we get all the information to you. And we are really honored to be sharing this in Pride Month. June is historically Pride Month to commemorate and honor the working class Black, Brown, and trans people who rioted against police brutality and police surveillance in 1969. The first Pride was a protest, and I truly think for the first time in 51 years, this is the first Pride that truly embodies that notion. So we want to honor and name Black and Brown trans leaders like Miss Major, Martha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and those who led our movement. And those who continue to actualize and envision queer justice. We want to honor Tony McDade and Yana Dior. Those have been brutalized and murdered in the past month. And these attacks are also present in our public policy, where just yesterday, 45 announced anti-trans legislation being passed federally to prevent healthcare and for homeless people in gender segregated housing to have sex markers. And so it remains a time for vigilance, especially for our Black and Brown trans siblings. And so we highly recommend donating and supporting to LGBTQ organizations this month. I'll name some, but Black Visions, Sylvia Rivera Law Project, and so many others. And we'll be following up with a survey that also has those. So we're all part of the problem here, but the beautiful part of all being part of the problem is that we all get to be part of the solution. And so we're excited to offer some ways to be part of the solution and some context that people need, because this is a space where we can learn and ask questions.
Mhm. I think the next thing that we're gonna wanna do is, well, I don't wanna spend too much time. Well, I do want to set up the space a little bit. But I want to know who's here a little bit more. So if everybody could please, in the chat, share their name, their pronouns attached to that as well. And then kind of what brings you to this space, what you're hoping to learn here, and what you're curious about. And as you're doing that, just a couple of housekeeping things. We kind of want to frame this stuff as specific to our context as conflict peacemakers. And a lot of questions that come up for people when LGBT identity is being discussed are pretty definitional. So when that happens, people feel free to type all of your questions in the chat, like Reverend Jacqueline said, that it will be monitored, and we'll give you time throughout the conversation to have those questions answered. But if the questions are more definitional, definitely try to reference and look through the resources we've offered. There are some really good answers to stuff you can Google, essentially. So, but we'll try to do our best to answer all of the questions that we can. I'm seeing some beautiful responses coming into the group chat. Folks, feel free to continue putting those in. I'm hearing a lot about listening and looking for growth, uplifting that learning idea.
Thank you. And then Lauren, I believe, who's controlling the slides, could you click twice, I believe? One more. Perfect.
Yes. One more thing that I just kind of wanted to address was that guidelines for the space and setting up this space are that we're hoping to center the value of curiosity here. We really do want people to ask questions. And that said, we're presenting from our own experiences. Sometimes those experiences are really vulnerable. And we are going to kind of operate as though this is, we're not contesting our realness in this. We're not contesting the validity of queer identity. And we're not going to be really having a conversation about whether it's valid or not. We're operating with its validity front and center and giving you kind of, not with the intention necessarily of changing minds, but just offering information about who we are and best practices around it. So I just wanted to say that in terms of guidelines. So in this, I'm loving these things that are coming into the chat. This is really beautiful. And it's making me excited to continue talking. So let's just get into it. LGBT plus identities, community, and context is where we're going to start. So I think we can actually just go on to the
next slide.
Yeah.
So just starting off, in a lot of times when I'm working or training people, they are just like, this all seems like semantics. Like, does it really matter? And a lot of people question, like, it's just words. Why are people so sensitive? But I just want to remind everyone, we ground ourselves in the power of language. So like, language matters. And a lot of people ask, like, how could my words affirm or dismiss someone's identity? How do words reflect that? But the language has meaning because it has meaning. Like, we use words because they all have meaning. So like, language labels and categorizes people. So if you as a person can only refer to as individuals as he or she, what a statement that you're saying through your language is that you only believe that people can be man or woman, and it kind of perpetuates the gender binary, which is the idea that there are two sexes. There, like, gender is inherently related to your sex, and we'll talk a little about what that means. It also reflects perceptions and assumptions. So, for example, when we label people inmate or offender, rather than putting the person first as a person who is incarcerated, or if we call someone transgendered. Like, it reflects the perceptions and assumptions that we have about those identities. And that's been proven through so much that it can be really damaging to one's perception and dignity of self. So overall, our words have a tremendous amount of power, and language is part of social movements. We're constantly learning and unlearning new terms for all different movements because our language is infused with centuries of isms, racism, sexism. So unlearning that language is part of the movement. And so just being mindful that we're gonna learn some new terms and we're gonna unlearn some old terms. But being inclusive at its core is come from learning to be able to speak to and speak with identity and embracing identity. Next slide.
Thanks, Connor. I think something that I feel really important about labels is that people are often like, wow, just this alphabet soup, kind of like you said. And for me, the labels are for us. It's about us figuring out and creating names for who we are and the different manifestations of the identities. And then to help us find each other, essentially, get to know who our community is. So just a quick layout of the acronym itself. People are fairly familiar with LGBT, and recently more letters have been added, like Q, I, and A. Queer is what the Q stands for. Queer is a word that is reclaimed by radical queer organizers who embrace opposition to the gender and sexual binary, embrace opposition to social norms, and perceived lack of intersectionality within identities. And queer, we use it as an umbrella term. It sort of addresses the idea of deviating from norms. And that frames the other letters in the acronym. LGBT, lesbian, gay, and bi, or bisexual, are the sexualities that are included in the front end of this acronym. And those refer just to sexual orientations. And then beyond, the other side of the umbrella stem is T, which stands for transgender. And that's a gender identity, which is different than a sexual identity. I stands for intersex. A stands for asexual. And we will get more into what those means. Those are also offered in your resources as well. Connor, do you have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I would just say that when it comes to queer, a lot of people who, especially, I would say, I'm just going to name generations, but like Gen X and the baby boomer generation struggle with this because they've seen this wielded as a slur. And also, and we'll talk a little bit about an inclusion of like who should wield the use queer, like who should wield the word rather. Queer. But I would also just say, just like with the umbrella term, just understanding that we also recognize that it can be really challenging because in different cultural contexts, not everyone has the words to explain these in different languages. And so that's a challenge that I worked in working as a programs assistant for a LGBTQ resource center. And so we just want to acknowledge and name that this can be really challenging. And this presentation also is less focused on the 101 of identities because a lot of these can be Googled, and we're going to focus more on best practices. So we are going to kind of rush through this part, so don't feel like you didn't retain anything because you're not going to learn all these definitions and concepts by the end of this presentation, but be introduced to them. Then we can move on to the next slide. But the last thing we really want to offer is that I really think people will usually be like, okay, sexual orientation, that makes sense. But they get really confused when it comes to gender just because we haven't really been taught the dimensions of gender. And so I just want to offer a couple of terms and frames that might be a little more helpful to understand. And we also love graphics. So here's a picture we can offer as well. But gender is not a binary. And I think a really helpful way is that instead of embracing an either or mentality, people are this or this. I think queer communities really embrace the spectrum where it's like where you individually land. And that results in three different things. So first I'll start with, you can't see I always like use my mouse as a cursor, but you can't see that. But if you look at sex, so biological sex, these are the physical sex characteristics you're born with and develop, including genitalia, body shape, voice pitch, body hair, hormones, chromosomes. It's like the science. And one thing that we talk about is that biological sex is also not a binary, but because people who are intersex are born with ambiguous genitalia, they might be born with testes, but they actually develop breasts throughout their life. And so that's why we also refer to biological sex as a spectrum. So that is like your physical body, and that's one dimension of sex. That is not with gender. Gender is more internal, and gender is shaped by your different social and cultural norms. So like Sam's gender identity might look very different than someone who lives somewhere else in the world. So gender, that's why it's internal, is because it's influenced by so many different things. Our physical bodies might look the same, but our internal conceptions of like what's acceptable for gender and how people express their gender, it looks very different. So gender identity is in the brain, right? So like how in your head you define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with your understand for your options for gender. So this is also a spectrum where you might be like, I really identify like as a woman, that feels really good for me. So you might be further along this woman spectrum and vice versa for man, or you might be somewhere in the middle. You're just like, you know, I really don't feel strongly attached to either, or I really feel strongly about both. And so thinking about it as a spectrum can be really helpful in just understanding where people might be at. And then also, this is why sex and gender are different, is because our biological traits cannot also always determine our gender, because that doesn't make sense. I hear a lot like, if it doesn't bleed, you're not a woman. But also just like not all women menstruate because of menopause. People might not, like if someone doesn't have if someone had a hysterectomy, like they're still a woman internally. Biologically, they might have certain traits. But that's the point we're trying to make, where this term of biological essentialism, which means that your physical traits dictate your internal sense of gender, just doesn't work, because sometimes like people just go through, like people have different conditions that like, that doesn't necessarily sway like what they feel internally despite their outer body. So there's times where just like, it just doesn't work. If someone doesn't have breasts, like mastectomies, right? And then finally, gender expression, which I feel like that's where people, I think the way that I think explain this the most is like a tomboy versus a girly girl, right? So they both might really strongly identify as a woman. That is their internal sense of gender identity, but they express it differently. So like I've had friends who are express very masculine, and I've never seen them wear a dress in my life and wear pants and sweatshirts, and that is their gender expression. Still a woman, they're not trans, but they just really embrace like masculine ways that they dress and demeanor. And then there's people who are like hyper feminine, who comes to mind like the idea of like the 50s housewife. Both are valid ways to express gender, and basically we're just saying is that there's different ways for people to present that. So I think I'll stop with there, just because I don't want to get a little too over explaining. But essentially, if we think about biological sex, your gender identity, and your gender expression, and dividing the three, it's really helpful to more understand how people experience and go through their identity. Next slide, please.
So this is an exercise that was really helpful for me, and I thought it just explained the graphic that Connor showed us really well. So in the top left quadrant is sexual orientation, and that just addresses who people are attracted to, and names for that include queer, pansexual, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, gay, and heterosexual and straight. Pansexual is one that people have a lot of questions about. That essentially means that somebody's biology or gender is irrelevant. It's more about attraction to heart and whoever. Sex assigned at birth is the next section. The words we've included there are male, female, and intersex. Gender identity below that, the words that people use to explain their gender identity can include gender fluid, transgender, agender, bigender, cisgender. Cisgender means that your gender identity and sex assigned at birth match up and are the same, or close to the same. Non-binary means to reject binary gender identity, and two-spirit is a word that's used, mostly owned by Indigenous communities. And yeah, that one's kind of pre-colonial as well. GNC is an acronym for gender nonconforming as well. And then gender expression is sort of external presentation of gender. Words people have used to describe their gender expression include femme, butch, masc or masculine, androgynous. Some people are visibly queer or aim to be visibly queer. And then a word that I made up to describe myself is femme of center, which means that on a masculinity and femininity spectrum, if femininity is over here, I usually fluctuate somewhere in between kind of androgynous and feminine. And am not necessarily visibly queer, but that's, I sort of, and I think something to note about gender expression is that it's not only who I want to present myself as, but I think sometimes also I have in mind who I want to attract or who I want to be able to see certain things about me or express certain things about myself to other people with regard to who I want to attract. So I think we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, and then the next slide we just want to offer is because I think a lot of straight and cisgender people don't necessarily think about their own identity in these ways, because all of you have a sex assigned at birth, a sexual orientation, a gender identity, and a way you express that gender. So I just encourage if you just to apply this learning, fun activity, if you just want to quickly in your mind, I gave an example of my own of like sexual orientation as queer or gay. I prefer the label queer personally. I'm a male assigned at birth. I'm cisgender, meaning my gender identity internally aligns with my external biological characteristics. And then my gender expression is more masculine. I'm always wearing a beard. I wear clothes that are traditionally designed for male bodies, but I like Sam also, I identified that like people kind of make up a lot of words for gender expression because it's so unique in how you do it. It's like tomboy is one, but there's a lot of different ways. Like gender expression has less like set definitions just because like people present themselves differently, and we all have a gender expression and all of these identities. Next slide. And then Sam offered theirs as well. Is there anything you want to elaborate or add on before we kind of move past the 101, Sam?
I think you covered it. I don't think I need to say more. If folks have questions about more specific parts, definitely include them in the chat.
And if you're uncomfortable asking questions to the whole group, you can send things directly to Sam and I too. We also want to recognize that it can be uncomfortable, so we just want to name that. So next slide, please. And so I just want to name and talk about how LGBTQ identities are not new. I oftentimes hear people being like, why are these millennials and Gen Z like making up words, making up identities? Like, why do they want to be so different and weird? And so I want to name that this is not like a lot of the identities we're talking about are not a product of 21st century identity politics, but have existed for centuries in Indigenous communities. So throughout histories, we see LGBTQ intimacy and identities depicted in art in Greece, Egypt, India, and so many more traditional Indigenous nations here in what's now called the United States. And so what happened is that in the 1500s to 1700s, as Western Europeans moved into what now is called the US, colonialization destroyed and demonized identities that did not align with European sexual or gender norms. So like man and woman, which we've seen, which I think like the church and the role of that in Europe really shaped a lot of those norms of roles. And so part of that is that missionaries or explorers, colonizers, came and labeled any behavior they perceived to be different as savage, inhumane, and they took it upon themselves to rectify this deviance. And so we can see how historically we often tie modern oppression to LGBTQ people, or marginalization rather, to religion. And we see a lot of churches funding a lot of or not even churches themselves, but individuals who are very highly religious and really drive their values from from specific Christian churches or other religions as well. we can see how norms and practices of the church harm LGBTQ people historically. And also that connects way back to colonization. Like that's not a new, but this has been a historic pattern where missionaries would come in and see same-sex intimacy or people dress in ways that they were uncomfortable with. And so we want to place that in context. I'm not saying that being a religious person is bad, but we just need to place religion in its historical harmful context. And the language and labels have evolved for centuries as we make meaning of abstract identities. So a huge amount of the labels and identities that existed were gone, were erased. And so part of it is like remaking and re-envisioning what those identities look like. So because of these identities were silenced and suppressed for so long, it may seem like a lot of this is coming out of nowhere, but I truly believe it's like kind of a form of awakening. And indigenous culture, I also just want to acknowledge that like indigenous peoples, like I'm not trying to paint them as like this harmonious, like queer, like gender free, like utopia, because that's not a nuanced history. But I also put some books in the PowerPoint that you can all go look up to learn more about indigenous conceptions of sexual orientation and gender, because those are not my stories to tell and not to teach. Next slide, please. So I think sometimes people also are wondering like, I don't understand the queer history and I don't know history. And so the next two slides, I'm just gonna talk a little bit, hopefully not at you, hopefully it's interesting, but just talk a little bit more about like, what is the historical context of like how LGBTQ people have been shaped. And so I also won't be using pictures because personally, I just think one, it's triggering in this time, but also I really hate that we have to, as a society, like show brutalization in order for people to believe that harm has occurred. And so I'm not gonna evoke images, but rather just describe some of these images. So if it's like, wow, what a boring presentation, I just personally am not interested in displaying pictures of brutality, regardless, like in the context we're in and beyond. So I don't think I've come up with this specifically, but a way that I've really like theorized through my own academic studies is talking about this trifecta of harm, where it's of that LGBTQ people have experienced historically, particularly in the 20th century and post-war America, so post-1945. The categories we see are police surveillance and criminalization, the label of being diseased and disturbed, and then also violence and erasure. And so first, I'm going to start with police surveillance and criminalization. So as you may or may not know, like queer people have a history of being surveilled, especially by government agencies and police. Especially in urban areas, police would target anyone who was dressed or seemed suspicious. Many people were arrested and charged at the time what was called homosexual conduct. And so we see that driving history where figures like Bayard Rustin, who was a major figure in planning, a major figure in the civil rights movement, was relegated to the sidelines so that the civil rights movement was not associated with homosexuality. Not saying that we should cancel Dr. King from making that decision. I'm just adding nuance to history. And there's been a lot of instances where the feminist movement, the women's movement did not want it to be associated with lesbians. So we're seeing like historical figures and leaders being relegated to the sidelines and not being incorporated into mainstream movements. So part of why Stonewall or the Compton cafeteria riots in San Francisco, a lot of these things erupted is where police disproportionately targeted openly presenting people or people who did not pass or did not, for trans women, if they did not read as a woman to police officers, they would be disproportionately harassed. And so a person perceived as a male who dressed in clothing customarily designed for women could technically be arrested in New York for impersonating a female as recently as 2011. And those are remnants of 19th century statewide laws prohibiting wearing the dress of the opposite sex. So in effect, we see how our laws and policies have become a flexible tool for police to enforce gender norms and sexual norms. And these disproportionately impact LGBTQ people. Homosexuality became decriminalized in the US in 2003. So we have 244 years where the US as a country, attitudes and suspicions were an integral part of our culture. And so we did not unwork that in over 244 years. In the past 17 years, we have not unworked that. And there's still places, I think there's about 20 states where trans people can still be legally fired and discriminated against, because gender identity and sexual orientation have been differentiated in the law and are so disproportionately protected. And so we see all these policies bleed down to schools. So you may be wondering, like, how is this applicable to me? So like we today see these laws bleed into schools with like strict dress codes, school suspensions for queer couples going to Pride or having same-sex intimacy in the hall, and things like that. That was, I could not bring a same-sex partner to my prom. I was in high school, 5 years ago? So like, just like, it's still very real today in states like Minnesota, in states that seem very blue and liberal. Those norms are still there today. So that's police and surveillance criminalization summed up in like 3 minutes. So that obviously is not the totality of all of the information. And then we're going into labeled as diseased and disturbed. And so a major influence of this was the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and early 90s, which led to the major public perception that because AIDS was labeled as the gay disease, which played into historic representations and tropes of gay people being a contagion and spreading deviance through their lifestyle. And so especially there was a lot of like anti-gay ads where it'd be seen like a gay male bringing and luring a young boy into the car. And so due to the representation of specifically gay men and trans women interacting with young children and being pedophiles, we see those implications out today. Notice how almost all anti-bathroom legislation involves like men being people pretending to be women in the women's bathroom and not the reverse. That is playing into historical tropes of like queer people being predators, specifically men, or people who have been perceived to be men. And we also see in Hennepin County today where there was an active campaign to get an elementary school principal out of a school because they identified as gay in an elementary school. And there was a horrible campaign where people wanted them out because of for no other reason other than their sexual orientation. So, and queer teachers and counselors are often forced out of schools due to public retaliation. And so students who identify as LGBTQ don't have queer identified teachers. I did not meet a queer elder in my community, I think, until I went to college, and I'm not many people have the privilege to do that. So all of these labels of like disease, contagion, and disturbed result in a deep sense of shame. Transgender as an identity was in the data statistic manual as a psychiatric condition. So we're seeing also that label of mentally disturbed. And then finally talking about violence and erasure. So LGBTQ hate crimes are underreported and investigated, but also that makes sense because of what we learned from police surveillance and criminalization. If the option is I go to the police or nothing, people often choose nothing, because they don't want to engage with something that they perceive as violent. And so it feels unsafe to report, and also hate crime legislation doesn't necessarily work and fuels more people into the prison industrial complex. And so especially Black and brown LGBTQ people are disproportionately impacted and targeted for different hate crimes. And Black trans women specifically, conversion therapy, which is the practice of usually a religious therapist, like fixing a young LGBTQ person. Parents will send their camps to pray the gay away, where they will pray and hopefully become normal again. This has there's been millions of dollars funneled into Minnesota to keep conversion therapy alive. So people literally profiting off the trauma of LGBTQ people who are in unsafe home conditions. So join out front in banning the conversion therapy. And then 42 countries today still carry a fine, legally justify torture or execute LGBTQ people. So we're not able to access shelter. There's an inability for LGBTQ orgs in countries to access aid due to persecution. So at the end of the day, none of this is exhaustive. I'm exhausted from sharing that. But essentially, like, I think if helping divide these into 3 categories, is helpful in understanding like why historical harm and place into context matters when we talk about individual community building. Next slide, please.
So we are in Pride Month, and a lot of times when people think about Pride Month or Pride celebration, they think about a festival, think about walking into Target and seeing shampoo bottles with rainbow on it, and it's this like fun, lively, dancey, white thing. And just to reiterate that Pride was a riot. So we listed marginalization and surveillance and criminalization as a part of the way that people were harmed historically and over like still today. The reason that Stonewall took place is because it was a bar, is still a bar in New York where queer people could build community and go together. And it was routinely disrupted, and harassment routinely took place by police officers and in that situation. And there's stories from queer elders about how cisgender lesbian and gay men could, like when that was interrupted, could pretend that they were dancing together and avoid harassment. That's not the case for trans people and like visibly not binary adhering people. So those folks receive the most harassment in general. So I guess just the point that we're trying to make is that given the current climate, it's important to note that this was a riot. It was important to note that this was not a peaceful, dancey celebration that took place. It was a week of rioting and violence, and the riots were started when Black trans woman activist elder Marsha P. Johnson, who's pictured below, threw the first brick at a cop at Stonewall Inn on June 28th, 1969. And the riots that took place following that for that week were organized by Black trans women in general. And so Pride Month, as we know it now, exists and became public because of Black trans organizers. So I think we can switch on to the next slide, because especially, yep, we can go ahead with the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So we do really, really need to address within the current climate and over time in general, that queerness and LGBT identity exists in solidarity and in intersection with Black lives. There are parallel types of violence with marginalization and by surveillance and criminalization by police. And it is important to say that Pride riots borrowed tactics from the Black civil rights liberation movement. This quote from our Black lesbian elder, Angela Davis, is that certainly the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender movement would not have been conceptualized in the same way had it not happened against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. And within our own community, Black trans women are murdered at epidemic and underreported rates. So I think just generally within understanding queer liberation, it's important to continue centering and uplifting and following the voices of Black femmes, because they have been at Black trans femmes, because they've been at the center of almost every social movement in history.
Yeah, and queerness shows up in so many different bodies. And so what's really amazing but also challenging about queer organizing is that it is in solidarity with almost every movement. To me, queer liberation will not be achieved until all people are free. And I know Sam, that's a discussion that we have a lot. Next slide, please. And then final thing that we just want to talk about before we move into like what we can do in daily practices. This is kind of the broader context as quickly as we could do. We could do a whole week. We could write a whole book on like queer history and harm. But there's a lot of challenges in queer history and organizing. And so part of that is labels have evolved for centuries. And so as a result, it's really hard to study and learn about queer history. First of all, it's controversial to even get it in schools. So people aren't learning about it at all. But we also see like challenges where we talk about queer history. The labels that we use now in the 21st century did not exist. So I cannot go back in history and look back at Eleanor Roosevelt, who had a very public, documented, very intimate relationship with a woman. I can't be like, Eleanor Roosevelt was bisexual, because that is not a term that existed in Eleanor Roosevelt's time. So we can't retroactively go back into history and be like, well, queer icon, look at Eleanor Roosevelt, or we can't go back and talk about a lot of things because the norms were different. One thing that existed, what we would call homosexual conduct today, or gay sexual conduct, was the phenomena of Boston marriages, where women would live intimately together in apartments. They would share a bed, they would share a home together. In our eyes, we'd be like, oh, they're gay and they're together. But that was a socially acceptable way to exist, and people did not think about people who practice Boston marriages as gay. And so it's really hard for us to go back into history and be like, that's a queer icon. And also, we can't apply Western labels either. So we can't go and talk about Indigenous history and then label with Western binary labels, because our language cannot capture what those identities were, and only the Indigenous languages can. And so a lot of this is where our history is not documented, because queer people were considered a weird, disease disturbed. Why would people want to document that history? So as a result, because our history is not documented, our stories are not told. So a lot of people don't even understand what LGBTQ identities are until they attend trainings like this or meet a queer person and ask. And then also, like, our figures were often silenced. So we see like Bayard Rustin was a secondary figure in the civil rights movement. Alan Turing, who broke the code in World War I, was castrated by the British government on the account of homosexual conduct. Oscar Wilde died in the streets in Paris, even though being an iconic writer today, as a result of being blackballed for homosexuality. So our figures are silenced. And I think the biggest challenge is that I think marginalized identities, I think a lot about my Black queer middle schoolers that I work with, where they're like, well, Blackness, like there's nothing talked about in history except white culture. And if I didn't have my family, I wouldn't learn about this. And a challenge with the queer element of the identity is that queer people are often not born into biological queer families. So like, I did not learn about my history, and I did not get connected to elders. So it's really challenging to build community, to learn from our past, organize for our present, or like envision our future, when it took me to have to get a college degree to learn about my identity and my history. And so you'll hear a lot about choosing families, and that's a big part of the queer identity and journey, right? Where people get to choose their queer family. They have their biological family and their chosen family. Not everyone has that experience, but that is kind of like the community building we have to do, because we're a series of broken lineages, and like not everyone's safe to learn that history. So erasure is a major harm that we're looking at. Next slide, please. So just in the chat, actually I'll have Sam facilitate this because I've been talking for a bit.
We're okay. In the chat, if you want to, please contribute what's one takeaway so far, or what questions do you still have? And if any of the moderators received questions throughout the presentation so far, please place those in the chat as well. We just want to take a second to address people and things to help them move into the next part of the presentation. Somebody commented, Sue commented, I appreciate the relation of multiple oppressions. The language from Elizabeth.
And this is about the halfway through mark. So just so everyone knows, the next part of the presentation, this is kind of the broader macro, and we're going to focus more on the micro and how you as an individual can better work with and serve in this context, knowing what you now know about the historical roots. Continuum concepts.
Mm-hmm.
I love you all to keep reflecting in the chat. I think it's okay if we move forward just to respect time, but I would love if people could still reflect in the chat, and Sam and I will monitor that as we move forward. Does that sound good, Sam?
That sounds good.
All right, next slide, please. Connecting macro to micro, stunning. Next slide again. Okay, so this is not my graphic, but this is a graphic from the Prison Moratorium Project. And so this kind of helps ground specifically the school to prison pipeline for trans youth. This is also in the handout folder that you have a link to. But so a lot of us are mediators or restorative justice practitioners and work in conflict. And so a lot of that work involves school and housing. And so these are kind of the pathways that are really real and tangible for trans youth, and oftentimes queer youth as well, specifically in these two. But in school, if people do not feel included and drop out due to severe harassment and discrimination by not only their peers, but their teacher, and they say school safety officers, but they're police officers. So as a result, they might not graduate high school or go on to college or get a GED. So it's really hard to find a job with a livable wage. So that results in unemployment or underemployment, where gender identity discrimination and harassment leads to a lack of jobs, leaving jobs, or getting fired because of arbitrary rules that were broken because they don't adhere to the norm. And then they might be arrested for committing survival crimes like sex work or selling drugs for income, because if they can't get an employed job because they don't have a degree because they feel unsafe in school, what else do people do but have to go to alternative means to survive that are criminalized, where they're not being only criminalized for their identity, but also for the actions they are taking. And so this huge cycle in the middle where shelter or foster care, they're denied from gender segregated shelters if they're homeless, or they're not allowed to express themselves in foster care group homes. Like, how harmful is it where you can't express a fundamental part of yourselves or your identity? And then talking about like the home. So if you identify as LGBTQ, in this case, specifically transgender or gender variant, you're kicked out of the house, or you can't leave home because they can't express themselves or are being abused psychologically or physically by their parents or their family members. And so this mix of unemployment, shelter, foster care, homelessness, or shifting schools, this results in being entangled in the juvenile criminal punishment system. Just a note on language is that I don't use the words criminal justice or juvenile justice system. So if I talk about those systems, I will call them what they are, the punishment system. Once there's justice in these systems, I'll call it justice, but we punish, and they're legal systems. I encourage you to join me in that language, or I'd love to talk more about that another time. But so, when they get to the juvenile criminal punishment system, they're subjected to physical, sexual, verbal abuse based on their gender identity or sexual orientation during searches, intake procedures, and are often put in the wrong gendered facilities based on their genitalia. So a lot of trans women will be put in men's facilities, which is extremely violent. And also, queer people are also put in segregated housing, where they're often put in solitary confinement, which is a psychological torture, because that is the only place where they can be kept safe. And I'm not advocating for we need LGBTQ inclusive prisons. I think we have better ways that we can do without addressing it. Trans people are denied access to hormones and other necessary medical treatments, and there's such little information on trans youth in the legal system. And so they remain unseen. So what my point is with all of this is, one, like, that's the school or home prison pipeline. It is really hard to intervene at the bottom with the juvenile and criminal punishment systems, which a lot of us might get our referrals from. It is really hard because there is additional, all the trauma they had to go through from that initial not being seen or included at home or school. Since those of us who work with schools or are in schools, if you are inclusive and see them and affirm them, it is much easier to be supportive at the top of this pipeline rather than at the bottom, because there's so much more trauma endured. So this is just, I hope, a context for all of you to think about like why your individual actions matter, because these are the things you're initiating if you're yet another person who doesn't see or feel like you're able to support LGBTQ people. So this is not a call out saying like you're causing this every day, but rather like, here's the implications of your inaction. And your peers and colleagues' interaction too, because you're obviously taking action today. Next slide, please.
Ooh, okay. So as we're moving into the more micro part, I just want to share a story right away about just the use of inclusion practices. In another part of my life, I was a server at a restaurant, and there was a regular who would come in who was somebody who was visibly queer to me, and I think other people there as well. And they would come, and the host knew that I was queer, so they would seat this regular with me every time because they knew that I wouldn't misgender them, and had at least some amount of like finesse around it. So this regular, I would see them almost every weekend at brunch. And then eventually we got to know each other well enough where I was like, I just want to check in. Am I addressing you correctly? What are your pronouns? And they were like, thank you for asking. You've never misgendered me. That's actually why I keep coming back. I really, really appreciate it. I use they, them pronouns. So that was a really cool relationship. There was one brunch that I didn't work, and this regular had a really bad interaction with a server and talked to a manager, and the manager handled it really badly and made them feel unwelcome and kind of tore away the feeling of safety and comfort and welcome that this establishment had for this person. And they stopped showing up for brunch. And when I asked why the regular had stopped showing up, they told me about this interaction. And I was like, I was just so disappointed because I only had control over my ability to implement ways that made them feel comfortable. And that wasn't seen throughout the whole organization.
Yeah.
And that's really devastating when you feel like that sense of trust started to be developed and then find that it's not throughout the rest of the environment. And so I think something that's really important to say is that much of queer identity at its core is an invisible identity. You can't tell by looking at somebody if they're queer unless they want you to know. And I think so that makes a big part of queer culture and how queers interact with things to be a signal system. When we come into spaces, usually we can read the attitude of the space pretty quickly. And so inclusion practices on the front end are a good way to start building trust. That said, that feeling does need to be throughout the whole experience, or it feels really, really performative. So I want to frame this section with that thought. I think we can go on to the next slide. So there's this idea of coming out in queerness. And a lot of people think of it as like the first time somebody owns publicly that they are part of the LGBTQ plus community. And it either goes really well or really poorly or somewhere in between. And that's the only time that happens. Frankly, that's not the case, that's the only time that happens. There is maybe a public coming out, but an individual's identity journey evolves over time, and we come out in every space. I come out probably once a week, sometimes once a day, depending on the week, and with every new person that I meet. And people may not come out if the space is not perceived as comfortable or safe. And so I think it's really, really important to know that as long as it's not coerced, consider someone coming out to you to be an act of trust. And a really good way to celebrate that is to thank them for trusting you. Also to say that an individual's identity journey is private and it's really only theirs to truly know. So I think something that's worth saying is that LGBT identity can be a privilege because it can be an invisible identity. But I think that it's also really, really easy to marginalize that identity. And then just a proactively inclusive practice when you're interacting with life in general is to always operate as if someone queer is in the room, because you truly don't know who is. And you don't know how they perceive that space. So another good practice is to just not out people in general. It's their thing to share with other folks.
Yeah. And one thing I want to read, like a story and a couple examples from Sam and I's work as restorative justice facilitators, is so like once we were in Circle, and I think it was our 8th cycle with students. And then my coworker Alexis, like I think modeled what Sam was talking about of thanking them. We passed around the talking piece, and I think we were talking about social media. And then literally a student was like, I just have something to say. I'm gay. And then said it to the space, and Alexis was just like, thank you for sharing that, and like did not make a huge deal about it, did not like bring out the trumpets and drums, was just like, thank you for sharing that, I really appreciate that, and then kept it pushing. And I think that's just a perfect example of just like, they obviously felt very safe in the space, so taking that as a huge compliment to yourself, but also just like no one reacted weird, all the students were like, how cool, fun for you. And then also the like not outing people. So this is where if someone acknowledges that, so I worked with a couple of students where I noticed in the hallway, they were being called one name by their friends, or in a queer space, like we worked at a Gender and Sexuality Alliance, or GSA. And they were one name in that space, but on the roster and by their teacher, they were called one name. And so I wanted to make sure that I was affirming them. So I just like went to them and I was like, hey, I hear you going by these 2 names. Which one would you like me to call you by, like refer to you as? And they went with their chosen name, not the legal name. And I was like, stunning. Is it okay if I call you this by your teacher or in Circle? Or do you want it to just be between us? And they said, just between us, please. And so what I did is like in class, I would call them by their legal name with their permission. And then in Circle or like individually when we were hanging out, I would use the name that they chose, and really embodied that. So that's where sometimes it's just like picking up on those signals. If you observe like someone is kind of like holding 2 names, just asking. Also, just people have a nickname, it's nice in community building to refer to a nickname, because like, I don't know, how weird is it for someone to be like, hi, my name is Michelangelo, but I go by Mike. And you're like, nope, your name's Michelangelo, and I'm always gonna call you by that. So I don't know, that was just a transition, but next slide, please.
Pronouns. So we had you introduce yourself with pronouns and add them to your photo tile. And just quick definition is that a pronoun is a noun that refers to somebody in a conversation. Everybody has pronouns. And usually the way that we know them is in binary terms. So he, him, and she, her pronouns. When you're adhering to binary use of pronouns, sometimes I understand that there's a sense about what is most comfortable and previously practiced, and words in context are really important to people. That's often something people say. We have needed a way to refer to people who don't identify on the binary. And the way that we've started addressing that over the past number of years is by both making up pronouns and by adding they, them pronouns to our dialogue and dialect. So a they, them pronoun can refer to somebody who's non-binary, but it's also all-encompassing. And people can have multiple pronouns, and they can change over time, because I think a really important value that I find within queerness and queer identity is that we're constantly creating ourselves. And so people have to come to terms with different versions of themselves and their personal manifestation of queerness once they are on that journey. And so over time, I've used different pronouns, and the ones that I currently use are both she, her, and they, them, and I use them interchangeably. I think it's really, really important when you're figuring out how to use pronouns that you may intentionally or unintentionally address somebody by the wrong pronoun, and that's called misgendering. and it can really be violent. It can really, really shut down somebody in a context and just disrupt trust in general. So a proactive practice is to always introduce yourself with pronouns and to use they, them pronouns with people who you don't know. You can always ask people theirs, but just be mindful of context with that. Not every space is going to be perceived as safe, and you might not be perceived as safe if somebody doesn't know you, or even if they do know you. So it's a good practice. I think that to say that when other people use pronouns in spaces without prompting, it says to me that when I'm entering a space that there are other people who have literacy around queer identity and that I can speak my truth in that space. Or because if I'm the first person to use a pronoun in a space, I'm making space for queerness there. That's to me what that says. And so if somebody else does it first, it makes me more comfortable automatically.
Yeah, especially if you as a circle, if you're facilitating a circle or a gathering, if you model that for the first part, you are immediately helping ground the circle in like queerness. And if people resist it, like have the literacy around explaining like why pronouns are important, because it sometimes makes people really uncomfortable. I was once in a circle where someone ended up in tears because they were so uncomfortable by using their pronouns. I'm not making fun of them, but it was a really weird space because the facilitator didn't understand why they did it really, and then all the queer people in the room had to explain why, and it got defensive. So like just proactively introducing yourself with pronouns in every space, putting it on your email signature, putting it in your Zoom call right away when you join. Sam and I did that, and just have part of our routine, having it in your email signature, social media. You can add pronouns everywhere. Next slide, please.
Just quickly, the kind of really big do's and don'ts of this are do not ask somebody who's transgender to consider using different pronouns so it's easier for you. That's extremely violent to their identity. And also don't force your guilt on somebody who you might have misgendered. Just apologize and keep it pushing. Or you don't even need to apologize, because then that calls the need from them to tell you that it's okay. So it can be as easy as just saying, I mean they, them. Like if you accidentally she, her somebody, and say they, them instead. Does that make sense? And we've included also resources on how to practice that. So then a really good do practice is just practice by yourself referring to somebody with they, them pronouns. Practice it in dialogue. That's their car over there. They are my friend. That bag is theirs. That kind of thing. And do correct somebody if they're misgendered and that person is not in the room to correct for themselves. People have had questions about this with relation to outing people. If you know somebody's pronouns, you can use those pronouns, correct them in that. But just, again, it's kind of going with the idea that always act as if somebody's queer in the room.
Yeah, and so part of that confusion might be, so like I do in the bottom quadrant, so you're just like, but wait, you just said not to out people. If someone introduces themselves in Circle, for example, I keep going back to Circle because that's just my reference and I know a lot of you are familiar, but like if someone's like, hi, I'm Connor and I won't use myself, I'm Allie and I use they, them pronouns, and so they introduce themselves in the space in the Circle. Then like during a break, you're like chatting away and then Sam goes, oh, Allie, she's great. A great proactive practice, you can be like, hey, Sam, actually, so like, just, hey, Sam, just want to let you know that Allie uses they, them pronouns. And then Sam could be like, oh, cool. Sam could also react very uncomfortably and be like, well, I'm a good person. And then be defensive about it. Like if someone corrects you on pronouns, like everyone does it. I've messed up pronouns, like a very close friends of mine, and I got called out. They're just like, you're making me so uncomfortable. I know you're a good person. Can you just leave me the hell alone? So you don't need to like jump into this like, I care about the LGBTQ, right. Like that's unnecessary. Just be like, cool, got it, thank you, and just apply and move on, because that's all we can do. And then it took me 4 years to learn how to, so what I've started to do is I actually just refer to everyone as they, them until told otherwise. And that's taken me probably 4 years because I never met someone with they, them pronouns till I moved to Minnesota. And so like, just so you understand like how long it takes to reprogram, like you're not gonna do it perfectly. I still mess up, but it's really helped me to be more inclusive as a default referring everyone as they. Which just feels comfortable to me and just as advice that I would pass on to you, just because then it's just approaching everyone with an all gender spectrum, like an all encompassing pronoun as Sam talked about. Next slide, please.
So within our work, we receive referrals often or information from other people telling us about themselves. So a really useful place to signal inclusivity is on a form. And so we've included an example of one here that is used for medical purposes. Not all these questions are relevant, but they include things like, I would like to be called. So you can ask somebody what their chosen name is and just a line there. And then my pronouns are as well. In our context, it's not necessarily relevant to ask what somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity is. And so good, proactive, and I know that sometimes funders and funding streams require gender breakdown for things, but if at all possible, include a write-in line or take it off the form entirely. It's just not super relevant to many things. You'll learn what somebody's gender experience is by speaking to them. That to say, if you're going to include those questions on a form, make sure anybody administering them understands how and why to use those questions. It can be really harmful or just weird to ask somebody what their pronouns are and then not use them moving forward, like or not know why they're there. Like if somebody was to say a form and or give a form, and then the person filling out the form was to say, why is this here? And if the person said to me, I don't know why that question's there, I would be a little put off. Connor, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would say just with forms, like, and so someone's like, well, I have to use my form of my intake. You can create another separate form that is just, I've seen this used by professors, like, I would like to be called blank, my pronouns are blank, because to Sam's point, often we're entangled in systems and people use legal documentation. I think as a peace building and relationship based profession, we are more than empowered to ask questions that and individualize and learn what people would like to be called. Just because someone's name is on a form does not mean that is the name they use. And so I think that's the biggest thing I'd want to add is just like legal documents often list dead names. And so, which we're talking about in the next slide. So next slide, please. Yes.
Dead naming can be as uncomfortable as misgendering somebody, but basically it's a really big process to get your name legally changed. It's not huge, but also it can be expensive as well, which so when we receive referrals from court or police or schools, typically those are going to have legal names on the forms. And if somebody doesn't go by their birth name, the name they were given at birth, or their legal name, it really doesn't fit people sometimes. If you have somebody who is maybe a trans person who's really masculine and their birth name was Jacqueline, that name really doesn't fit that person at this point, or maybe it never did. And if they tell you they go by Jack, don't call them Jacqueline. So just an inclusive practice in general is to ask people verbally and on forms what they want to be called and try to always use that name moving forward. I think something that is also really important to me in this context is asking is a really good thing, but a lot of times queer people experience a sort of like sensationalization with like, oh my gosh, that's such an interesting name. Wow, Scout, I just where did you come up with that? Like that kind of thing. That's a really, really uncomfortable space to be in. So just, that's something, if you're going to ask somebody's name, don't make it weird when they tell you a name that you didn't expect to hear. Connor, do you have more on that?
Yeah, no, I think you killed it. Next slide,
Cool.
please.
Next slide. In terms of facilitating sessions in kind of a brick and mortar location, think about facilities. Everybody has to pee, and many facilities have gendered bathrooms. If your facility has access to an all gender or a single user bathroom, it's going to be the most affirming. But always offer all the bathrooms if you can. So when you meet somebody new who comes in, a lot of times I'll hear people say, like, make an assumption about somebody's gender and then say, well, the ladies' room is over there. If that person is not a lady, that is very uncomfortable. So a really useful thing to do is to say both of the bathrooms are over there, or the women's room and men's room is here and here. But only offering one is, because you're making an assumption about somebody's gender, is it can be really uncomfortable. And then just to say that the people that you're interacting with, staff, volunteers, and then community members in restorative or mediative settings, just consider in session facilitation, are there openly queer people represented in your staff and volunteer base? If there are they comfortable within your organization? If there aren't, why aren't they there? And if you get a referral related or a case related to homophobia or transphobia, I would just say that I would highly recommend getting a facilitator or community member who is part of the queer community or who feels extremely confident in the nuance of how to address that experience. Connor, do you have more to say about that?
Yeah, I would say one thing that I've seen in my workplaces is I think in peace building professions, we often try to use our own experiences and stories to kind of equate, but it can become really weird. And I'll give an example of a tweet I saw last week that I thought really, like, how analogous feelings cannot come off as affirming. So I saw a tweet the other week where it was someone tweeted, like, I was talking to my boyfriend and I was talking about how my parents are getting divorced and I'm getting disowned by whatever parent's side I don't pick. And then he replied, I get exactly how you feel. My dog died last week. And so what we're seeing in that, if we analyze like the intent was to express a feeling of loss, right? Because that's what they were feeling in that tweet. They were feeling a sense of loss of a parent and like feeling that they're going to get, and knowing that they're going to get disowned if they have to pick a side. So like you saying like, oh, a loss I've experienced is my dog died. See how that can just be kind of very belittle the situation if you say no exact, or like one that happened to me personally was just like talking about like I grew up suppressing my identity a lot of my life for survival, and then a coworker, well-intentioned, said like I've also like how I grew up had to suppress myself as a woman in the workplace. So like a perfectly valid thing to say, but that it felt very belittling to me. Because I was like, that's not at all what I experienced, because I was doing it out of like survival of not getting like harassed. And so like just note like so that's why we say just like the queer literacy is like if you're expressing affirmation or like in a session or like they voice that experience, you can just say like a better way to frame that is like I've experienced like loss or suppression, like I've experienced like I can't imagine that like in your own experience. Thank you for sharing. And appreciate you like offering that or something to that extent, instead of you like offering analogous feelings for the sake of like feeling uncomfortable because you can't exactly relate to that experience. It's the same thing when we're talking about like racial or cultural differences too, where it's just weird to be like, I know exactly how you feel, because you don't. And that's okay, because like the whole point of view is that you don't need to know exactly someone's journey in order to support them on their way. Next slide, please.
Yeah, just to summarize this section, I guess the biggest takeaways we want you to have are that your language matters in this space, and proactive inclusivity is a good way to not unintentionally harm somebody and to be inclusive. and proactive inclusion, like we can tell when the work is not all-encompassing and cohesive within an organization. There's no need to scramble to change everything right away without understanding. And it's going to be as important to continue doing reading and learning and listening to stories to build kind of finesse and impulse and instinct around how to operate. And kind of lastly, show up for LGBT people when they're not in the room. If somebody, just correct pronouns as often as possible and have LGBT people on staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like with allyship, it mean if a queer person's not in the room or you're like really homophobic, transphobic uncle is like going off, like some of the most powerful things you can do is engage in that dialogue instead of avoiding it. I think a lot of people avoid conversation on LGBTQ identity because they don't feel like they're ever confident enough, but you know by instinct that you can say like interventions that I've used is like, why is that, like, can you explain to me how that's funny? And like, or just like, why, like, what's led you to think that? And like engage in those conversations so that a queer person in the space doesn't have to, or like then go dump it out on your queer friend. It's like, they said this and this and this to me. And then like, we have to like tell you how to, anyway, with that dialogue. And then the other thing I want to say is like on the language of queer, just because I realized that I just think, just to name that, if you are straight and cisgender, I would avoid using the word queer as a descriptor. And I say that whereas like, so Sam and I work with the Envisioning Queer Justice Collaborative. If you're saying it as a proper noun, like obviously that's cool, but I would say Sam saying, oh, Connor's queer, versus someone else, like a straight cis person saying Connor's queer, will come off very differently to me. So like even if you have like queer siblings, or like I'll use my mother for example, my mom has a queer child. If she went out in the world and like addressed other people that way, which they may be very uncomfortable because they don't know that she has that personal relationship, and those be like. And I think with queer, like because it was a slur, if you're not part of the community, I just wouldn't advise you using that word. You can just say LGBTQ or LGBT, whatever rolls off the tongue easiest as you learn and build literacy, just because I would say queer is for the community and not for allies or others. And we can talk about that more, but that to me, just know that it's a very controversial word. Not everyone in our own community necessarily identifies with it. I didn't until 2 years ago and really hated it. So just to be safe, knowing the implications of that is what we recommend. So next slide, please. We're on our last little hurrah. So essentially, to summarize all of this, like how can you help and support LGBTQ plus people given your values and skills as a peace builder? So restorative justice, transformative justice, mediation, whatever your background is in, how can you help? Next slide, please. And so what I just want to highlight on is that I believe that restorative transformative justice offers community-built processes to address these ongoing systemic and cultural harms. So like we are creators and facilitators of ways to address healing and addressing harm, but we also must be able to hold space with LGBTQ people in order to do that, because queer people are really underrepresented in the peace building professions. I don't exactly understand why that is. There's not a lot of people in my community who are RJ facilitators. I think part of it is the huge presence of religion and how the church is very present, not saying that all Christianity is or like religion is like demonizing, but it is off-putting. I know I have apprehensions when I enter religious spaces out of my own self-preservation and past experiences. So we don't know why that is, but because people are underrepresented, part of our job is not only empowering more queer people to join the profession, but also being part of space. Many of these things that happen, they're not addressed, and that results in a lot of resentment and violence and queer people just feeling more isolated and alone. And then they are punished for and go into systems for not being engaged in school because they're tired of being harassed every day. I worked with one student who switched schools 4 times because they could not be in school. And so all of these different things is like the systems only punish and cause harm more. So if we can be a presence to affirm and uplift and share space and build relationships with, that is how we're going to heal the divide, is being able to like not only be confident enough in engaging in these conversations, but actively addressing the individual harm and transforming the broader context as to why these systemic and cultural harms still occur. And so part of you being in that movement and healing the divide is being able to be present and being able to show up and understand and reactively understand nuance of gender and sexuality. And we're still learning about it, but being a community with people is how we are going to address that forward. And so with that, unless you have anything to, do you have anything to add, Sam?
I think we're just at the point where we're ready to take questions. I know that we've got 4 minutes left on the clock, and I want to respect people's times.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say that Reverend Jacqueline, when we kind of met her the other day, she is a really, really cool, had a really cool perspective on like spiritual community related to queerness. And I think like a really good 2.0 conversation to this one will be to have more nuanced conversation. Like this really is just a lot of context. Obviously, this is a really content heavy presentation. And best practices so we can get more into the nuance once people are more comfortable with what it actually means to be LGBT identified. Yeah, absolutely.
Lauren, I think we hand it back to you all if you have a specific closing out or however the next part is.
Well, Jacqueline, what would you like to say to wrap us up?
Well, I first of all would like to say thank you. If we can get the faces on, bring your faces in. Even if you don't unmute, but bring your faces in. And let's give a hands up to them for what they have done. Or a snap. Just want to say thank you. But I did have one question. We didn't have any in the chat, but I do have a question. And my question is, how can the church leadership help in this process? And I know that everyone don't think like me, and I'm all right with that. But I just want to know, what is it that we can do to help? How can we help? How can we have these conversations?
So for me, my immediate reaction to that, I think the church has a lot, and not just Christian churches, but has a lot of acknowledgement to do. I think like as we know in the first part of the restorative or transformative processes, it's acknowledging that harm. And so I think just an acknowledgement from churches that I've seen a few like reconciling ministries where they're like, we acknowledge we've done X and we have been complicit in this. And the other part is naming and having that, for me, educating and engaging people, bringing in queer people into communities that are comfortable, because there are plenty of queer people who are very comfortable, who are very vocal and have very beautiful things to say. I know I would not be one of those people who would be good at that, but I think like bringing people in your congregation in these conversations matters, because why so much of the cultural harm still exists is that we don't talk about it because we don't learn about it. And so part of it is just like, I don't know if that's like what I would consider like where I'm like, yay, harm's addressed. But I do think starting it is the acknowledgement of harm, publicly and as a congregation engaging in why, instead of just church leadership being like, here's what we did, and everyone being like, I don't agree with that. And getting everyone on the same page of why we're acknowledging, and then having those conversations and bringing people into your community is one step, I think, that I'd want to offer. But that's what, for me, I think a lot of people would have different opinions on that. Sam, if you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Connor. I had just muted myself because my partner is out of the camera and they had an idea about it, and they're a little too shy to come on the camera right now, so we're not doing that. But they said that it felt like education, like just kind of dispelling some of the misunderstandings or like ideas about perversion within queer identity would be a really good place to start. And then I think I saw Sue put something in the chat that was about changing harmful rules around it, that there's some really like specific like public inclusive practices that would make it much more affirming to be part of a community. I wouldn't want to join a congregation that I couldn't get married in, that kind of thing.
Well, thank you so much to Connor and Sam for joining us today and for presenting all of this really informative, wonderful information and telling us some really good tips on what we can do. And it is time, so I want to direct everybody's attention to the chat. Deandre is going to post a couple of resources that Connor and Sam shared with us that they would like for you all to have of how you can stay involved and learn more information. And then we're also going to post a few things about the 2 upcoming events, one on this coming Saturday, the 20th, and then next month, July 11th. And I just want to thank our sponsors, Community Mediation Minnesota, Freo, Metropolitan State University, ADR Notable, and also our friends of CRM Echoes Healing Stones. And of course, we're a chapter of the Association for Conflict Resolution. Please, please, please like us on Facebook. If there's one thing that you can do to help us is spread the word about these Healing the Divide events. And if there's anybody, you or anybody you know that wants to send people to these events, all they have to do is be a sponsor, and then they can get a discount code for half off for unlimited use of that discount code to send all their staff, all their volunteers, anybody in your group. And if you want to stay involved with us for the Peace Committee is a great way to be involved, Public Education and Awareness Committee to help continue this movement and this Healing the Divide movement. And we are actively looking for mentors, so if you could contact us at info@conflictresolutionmn.org. We have people who have applied to be mentees who need you to be their mentor and become a member, and that is awesome. You can register back for the May 9th, or any of these that you missed, you can register and get the recording. And we look forward to seeing you Saturday and next month. And Jacqueline, if you want to just close us up with a wrap-up statement.
Well, I would like to just, first of all, thank you everybody for participating, because we know that this was one of those subjects that could be perceived as being hard and difficult to talk. Actually, I would love to have some face-to-face. I know after all of these things take place, and with COVID-19, we get a chance to do some kind of time together would be really, really great. And just be able to bring some of the leaders in, because I think it's important that we hear what you have to say. Is very educational. And I'm open for a part 2. I know I said that, but I probably shouldn't say that because it's a lot of information. But I really would prefer face-to-face on the second part, if that's possible. So with that being said, I would just like to thank the 2 of you for coming and sharing information with us. Hopefully we didn't make you uncomfortable, but I just thank you. Thank you so much. And the committee and the board would like to thank you. So unmute, show your video if possible, let them see us, and let's give them a round of applause if possible, or a finger snap.
Yes, thank you. Connor posted our eval in the chat as well. Please fill that out so that we can get feedback on the presentation.
Please do.
And then we can start planning a part 2 if that.
Yeah, very short. Any additional comments if you want to? We just finished doing with LGBT youth across the state of Minnesota, the LGBTQ justice circles. If we want to talk more about justice, healing the divide, and like addressing needs that LGBT youth specifically identified, I think that's something that we could definitely invite you all to. So thank you so much for your time and listening and sharing space with us.
I just want to echo what Connor said as well. I posted 2 separate links to like the Envisioning Queer Justice Collaborative. So if you could like the Facebook page and sign up for the newsletter, that would be awesome. Thank you.
I just have one last comment. If possible, if you have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or whatever, please take the time out, if you don't mind, just to do a check-in on your Facebook for this webinar for today. Because we might have people that have questions and and share information with them if that's possible. Anybody else from the committee or the board?
Thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you on Saturday, June 20th.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks, Connor and Sam.
Thank
That's
you.
7 days from right now. Now it's 7 whole days from now.
Thank you.
See you
Bye,
next week.
everybody.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
All right. Have a good afternoon and be safe out there.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.